Committee on Middle East, North Africa, and Central Asia will come to order. The purpose of this hearing is to address the Iran-backed Houthis' threat to Yemen, the Middle East, and the United States' national security interests, including through their many significant attacks on international shipping in the Red Sea and Gulf of Aden since October 2023. We will discuss the threat posed by the Houthis and the Biden administration's response to the dramatic uptick in Iran's malign activity across the region. I now ask consent unanimously the gentleman from North Carolina, Dr. Murphy, be allowed to sit on the dais and participate following all other members in today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. I also ask consent that the statement for the record by Behnam Ben Taliblu and related report be entered into the record. Without objection, so ordered. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. And ladies and gentlemen, I'm Joe Wilson, Chairman of the Middle East, North Africa, and Central Asia Subcommittee of the Foreign Affairs Committee, and a grateful member of Congress from South Carolina. Since the fall of Sana'a, when Houthi terrorists violently overthrew the internationally recognized government of Yemen, the Hamas puppet Houthis, along with the Iranian other puppets, have made territorial gains and have expanded their capacity to carry out a mass murder directed by the regime in Tehran. The Iranian regime terrorist puppets in Yemen, the Houthis, have launched over 30 attacks on commercial and naval vessels in the Red Sea since November. Their capacity to field such attacks is a commentary on the Iranian regime's direct support for its network of terrorist puppets and their growth in the region. The Houthis and other puppet terrorist groups funded, trained, and supplied by the regime in Tehran are operating with sophisticated weapons, including precision-guided missiles and long-range drones. The Houthis have conducted hundreds of attacks on our valued allies and partners in the region and have directly targeted U.S. targets, disrupting world shipping, fueling inflation for household products worldwide, and interrupting the delivery of grain around the world to countries that are in need. They receive material and political support from the world's foremost state sponsor of terrorism and have coordinated with at least 2 foreign terrorist organizations, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and Hezbollah, but were foolishly delisted as a foreign terrorist organization by the Biden administration in February 2021, only to be redesignated as a lesser specially designated global terrorist. Sadly, this is severely inadequate and does nothing to hold the regime in Tehran accountable for the direct support for the Houthi terrorist puppets. The Houthis have paraded identical copies of Iranian ballistic missiles, land attack cruise missiles, and anti-ship cruise missiles and suicide drones. We have seen some of these projectiles launched after October 7 toward our ally in the region, Israel, and formerly they had attacked Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. And more recently, at least 30-plus instances toward international commercial shipping in the Red Sea, spiking insurance premiums and costs for goods on vessels moving across a body of water where between 10 to 15% of global trade passes daily. The Houthis' ability to disrupt shipping gives the regime in Tehran a significant boost in legitimacy and is a key to their goal of death to America, death to Israel. Proxies of the regime in Tehran have benefited from Biden's hands-off policies and have conveniently attached themselves to the claims of the Palestinians. This is about fealty to Iranian regime and its agenda. The Biden administration and diplomatic pursuit of a disastrous nuclear deal has completely ignored the mass proliferation and development of missiles and terrorism by the regime, arming its proxies and dictator allies. The Iranian regime's missile program is a cornerstone of its nuclear program. President Trump was correct in canceling the deal, which did nothing to address the intercontinental ballistic missile program or proliferation of terrorism, as he successfully built deterrence to protect Israel and America with, indeed, the Abraham Accords. This administration, sadly, has completely failed to respond to and deter future attacks. Striking ammunition depot in Yemen after providing advance warning is not a sufficient deterrence. There is sincere bipartisan outrage over the conditions of extreme poverty in Yemen. Houthi terrorists have engaged in massive aid diversion to enrich themselves and their loyalists, while the people of Yemen continue suffering the consequences of the Iran-backed regime civil war. The people of Yemen deserve better than constant civil war due to Iranian regime-backed terrorism. We also understand the interconnection of the dictators with rule of gun invading democracies with rule of law. We see this, sadly, as we respect the courageous people of Ukraine, the courageous people of Israel, who are resisting the axis of evil, war criminal Putin, the regime in Tehran and its puppets, and the Chinese Communist Party. This administration must reverse course and restore credible deterrence to avoid further attacks and destabilization, and I believe if they did, it would be bipartisan. I want to again thank you for the witnesses being here today and your expertise, and I look forward to hearing now from the ranking member, Jerry Connolly, also known as past president of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. Mr. President.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Since November 19th, the Houthis, an Iranian-backed militia organization in Yemen, have attacked over 40 commercial ships and multiple U.S. naval vessels in the Red Sea with no signs of stopping. They've attacked commercial vessels indiscriminately, wreaking havoc on international shipping and the global economy. Just in the last 3 months, Houthi threats to ships, crews, and goods crossing the Red Sea have forced major shipping companies to spend millions of dollars, more fuel, and add an additional 10 days of traveling around the Horn of Africa that so far has cost $200 billion. The costly delay will ultimately be felt most significantly by many in the developing world who've already seen rising prices due to inflation caused by Putin's war in Ukraine, the COVID-19 pandemic, and other disruptions in the global supply chain. It's important that this subcommittee articulate that there's absolute clarity on a bipartisan basis when it comes to Houthi targeting of American service members or core American interests. Arbitrary Houthi attacks on commercial shipping have already disrupted a key pillar of the international order that has an impact on all nations, freedom of navigation. At its core, freedom of navigation entitles all countries, vessels, to transit around the world in peace, free from interference. The protection and promotion of this long-standing international principle warrants an international response, not to mention how Houthi attacks impact the global economy. The Biden administration has crafted a response that defends U.S. interests and deters further aggression while preventing regional escalation, which I believe we must be very mindful of. A strategy that some of my friends on the other side of the aisle, including you, Mr. Chairman, have criticized. A successful strategy is one that utilizes all the tools in our toolbox: diplomatic, economic, and if needed, and only as a last resort, military action. Some of my colleagues would like to see an administration that acts unilaterally to impose great costs on Iran and its proxies, committing American blood and treasure to another endless war in the Middle East, all while neglecting the devastating humanitarian situation in Yemen. Let's be clear. Calls for direct strikes on Iran are dangerous and undermine the administration's efforts to prevent an expanded conflict. A restart to civil war in Yemen will not achieve American objectives. And the Biden administration rightly sought to prevent wide-scale famine for Yemen civilians while degrading Houthi military capabilities and defending U.S. servicemen and facilities in the region. Such a strategy is critical for the millions of Yemenis who remain dependent on outside humanitarian aid for even the most basic of necessities. According to the United Nations, 18.2 million people in Yemen, more than half of its population, depend on such humanitarian assistance. 4.5 million Yemenis are considered internally displaced, and 17.6 million are food insecure. Years of bombing, ground combat, destruction, and impoverishment from the brutal war that had preceded this set of events forced millions of Yemeni civilians to suffer persistent food scarcity, resulting in near-famine conditions and widespread malnutrition, especially among children, recurring disease, medical goods shortages, and extreme economic hardship. A rupture of the tenuous ceasefire brokered in Yemen would mean another hot conflict in a region that can ill afford it. Since before the Houthis started attacking commercial shipping in November, the Biden administration clearly stated it is not interested in a broader conflict in the region. The administration has made clear that the United States will not hesitate, however, to protect our personnel both through action at the UN and direct military strikes. And it has followed through on that commitment. The United States supported a Security Council resolution condemning the Houthi attacks and urging against regional escalation in the days leading up to the military action, making the case to the international community on the need to hold the Houthis accountable for their action. The administration also imposed additional powerful sanctions on the Houthis by designating the group as a specially designated global terrorist group. This powerful measure sanctions the facilitation and support networks coordinated by Iran, which help keep the Houthi militants armed and equipped. The Biden administration also administered over 55 separate Iran sanction rollouts targeting more than 550 individuals and entities. And just this week, DOJ announced the indictments of IRGC leadership in Iran and others for terrorist sanction evasion, fraud, and money laundering offenses in connection with the trafficking and selling of Iranian oil sanctioned, as well as the seizure of more than 500,000 barrels of sanctioned oil. By all accounts, the administration's pressure on Iran is working. Just last week, the rial hit an all-time low, and the 12-month inflation rate is now at 46.7%, a record high in Iran since the U.S. imposed meaningful sanctions in 1996. Militarily, the United States has moved in concert with partners and allies to expand interdiction operations to prevent illegal Iranian weapons from reaching the Houthis in Yemen, and has established a 22-nation security operation to protect maritime vessels from Houthi attacks in the Red Sea. This is not just an issue that impacts the United States, but the entire international community. With the leadership of our country and the Biden administration, we have put together a broad coalition of partners to defend shared interests in the region to secure the freedom of navigation and open sea lanes of communication. I look forward to hearing from our distinguished panel and will very much appreciate a lively conversation. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you very much, Congressman Connolly. As an indication of how important this hearing is, we're very grateful to welcome the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, and we now recognize the Chairman Mike McCall from Texas for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Connolly. Since Hamas's brutal October 7th attack on Israel, Iran's proxies throughout the Middle East have launched assault after assault on the United States and our partners. The Houthis in Yemen have launched dozens of attacks against international shipping in the Red Sea and Gulf of Aden. These ongoing Iran-backed attacks threaten a wide array of international interest. They are driving up shipping costs, increasing insurance rates, and disrupting global supply chains. The Houthis' latest escalation is a symptom of the international community's failure to address the Houthi threat. For years, the Houthis have benefited from support provided by Iran and Hezbollah, which transformed this group of ragtag guerrillas into a fighting force with the capacity to destabilize the entire region and disrupt global trade. But the world has consistently downplayed this threat and Iran's role in enabling it. The Biden administration's policies have emboldened the Houthis at the expense of our regional partners. And by projecting weakness on the world stage, this administration has invited aggression. While Iran was smuggling weapons to the Houthis, this administration was busy lifting terror designations and cutting off support to Saudi Arabia and amid Houthi cross-border fire. Appeasement has no place in U.S. foreign policy, but that is exactly what has occurred in Yemen and beyond. Even now, this administration continues to treat the Houthis with kid gloves. They are promoting a UN peace deal that would legitimize the Houthis' violent, autocratic rule over millions of innocent Yemenis and secure Iran's foothold in Yemen. And despite redesignating the Houthis as a specially designated global terrorist organization, President Biden has refused to use the strongest tool at his disposal, and that is the foreign terrorist organization designation that they had prior to this administration. I think it's time to recognize them for who they are and redesignate them as a foreign terrorist organization. There could be no denying that the Houthis are terrorists and present a real threat. As attacks by the Houthis continue, urgent action is clearly needed to deter them and defend U.S. national interest. I look forward to this hearing and to hear how we can work with our allies and partners to protect our service members and the global economy, as well as steps to promote stability in the region. For nobody wants war. Nobody wants an escalation. Nobody wants war with Iran. But history teaches us that if we do not act in strength, but rather weakness, we will invite aggression, conflict, and war. It's as old as Neville Chamberlain and Hitler. Churchill talked about appeasement. Reagan talked about peace through strength. If we do not project strength, we will get conflict and war. 160 attacks on our soldiers in Iraq and Syria, and then Tower 22 in Jordan, with little response. It only begets more violence. Deterrence is necessary to promote peace in the region. And Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for holding this very important hearing. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Chairman Mike McCall. And we're pleased to have distinguished witnesses with us today. Ms. Simone Ledeen, the former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East. We're grateful to have also Dr. Kenneth Pollack, a former CIA analyst and NFC National Security Council Director for the Persian Gulf. Finally, we have Dr. John Alterman, Senior Vice President Director of the Middle East Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. We want to thank you all for being here today. Your full statements will be made part of the record, and I'll ask each of you to keep your spoken remarks to 5 minutes in order to allow time for member questions. I now recognize Secretary Ledeen for her opening statement.
Chairman McCall, Chairman Wilson, Ranking Member Connolly, distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Simone Ledeen, and I previously served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East. The Middle East is at a pivotal moment. The region is currently embroiled in a high-stakes, multi-dimensional conflict fueled by Iran's calculated aggression against the United States, Israel, and others. The evidence is clear. The Iranian regime is sowing this discord, which threatens international peace and stability. From the shadows, the regime is advancing its agenda by planning and funding attacks by its proxies. My focus today will be on one of these Iranian-backed proxies, the Houthis in Yemen, and how the U.S. should respond to accelerating Iranian aggression. The Biden administration's timid approach towards Iran has placed U.S. service members and crucial global trade routes at grave risk. The administration's policy of appeasement toward the Iranian regime has proven to be a dangerous fantasy, setting the post-Abraham Accords Middle East on fire. Urgent action is required to change course and reestablish deterrence. The Iranian-backed Houthis have escalated their attacks on commercial shipping and U.S. naval warships in the Red Sea since November 2023. The Houthis have used drones, missiles, and small boats to target both commercial and naval vessels across the southern Red Sea, the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, the Gulf of Aden, and the Arabian Sea. Companies have had to reroute ships around Africa, increasing shipping costs and travel times. Normally, an estimated 12% of international trade, amounting to over $1 trillion in goods, navigates through the Red Sea and the Suez Canal annually. Since the Houthi attacks began, freight rates from East Asia to Europe have surged over 200%. Since October 2023, the Houthis have used an alarming array of increasingly sophisticated weapons, including cruise missiles and land attack cruise missiles, unmanned aerial vehicles, unmanned surface vessels, essentially remote-controlled bomb boats, and anti-ship ballistic missiles, or ASBMs, making the Houthis the first in the world to deploy ballistic missiles against ships, signaling a sophisticated leap in their military capabilities, which now align with those of only a very few nations. At the same time, Iran and its allies have been exploiting maritime navigation systems to conduct operations with relative impunity in the Red Sea, often disguising their activities under the flags of China, Iran, or Russia. The Dark Fleet, as these ships have been called, enjoys a peculiar immunity from Houthi attacks, navigating with relative impunity, a fact which points to a level of coordination which should concern us all. The Houthis pose a multifaceted threat to Yemen, the broader Middle East, and U.S. service members. The Houthi movement, begun as a Shiite insurgency against Yemen's Sunni government, has, with Iranian support, become a key military player in the Middle East, devastating Yemen, creating a vast humanitarian crisis, and complicating U.S. and allied strategic interests in a broader Middle East proxy conflict. Additionally, the Iranian-backed Houthi chaos in Yemen has given al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula a favorable environment for training and attack planning. This is the same terrorist organization responsible for the USS Cole bombing and the Charlie Hebdo attack. The Houthi movement, central to Iran's strategy to increase its influence and disrupt the Middle East status quo, has escalated Gulf region tensions through missile and drone attacks on Saudi Arabia, endangering global oil supplies. Additionally, by targeting Red Sea routes, they significantly threaten Israel's supply chain, underscoring their role in Iran's broader ambitions to reshape regional geopolitical dynamics. The Houthis also threaten U.S. service members stationed in the region. The group's access to drones, missiles, and naval mines enables them to target U.S. forces, which they are currently doing, in attacks on U.S. Navy and merchant marine vessels. In the face of this threat, the United States must reevaluate its regional strategy. The contrast between the optimism fostered by the Abraham Accords in 2020 and the current reality could not be more stark. The disillusionment with the Biden administration's regional policy is palpable among our partners and allies. The Biden administration's early diplomatic efforts in the region, including pressuring Saudi Arabia to cease hostilities against the Houthis, delisting the Houthis as a foreign terrorist organization in February 2021, and attempting to revive the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action with Iran, has instead only emboldened them. According to the Foundation for Defense of Democracy, since the start of the Biden administration, Iran has successfully exported oil worth more than $100 billion. This dramatic increase in oil revenue explains how Iran is funding its terrorist proxies externally and domestic oppression internally. To effectively counter Iran and its proxies, the United States must take several steps. First, we must rigorously enforce sanctions targeting Iran's vital economic sectors, such as oil exports and banking, which could significantly cut its available funds for proxy terrorism. Second, the U.S. must establish deterrence and protect freedom of navigation by decisively targeting the Houthis and their IRGC sponsors, moving beyond the current ineffective defense-only strategy. By disrupting their operational networks and reducing Houthis' territorial control in Yemen, along with deploying additional U.S. military assets for rapid regional response, the U.S. will be in a much stronger position to restore global commerce routes through the Red Sea and Bab el-Mandeb. Third, the U.S. must enhance cooperation with regional allies to secure necessary access basing and overflight rights. This entails deepening strategic partnerships and expanding intelligence sharing mechanisms to effectively counteract Iranian influence. Fourth, the U.S. should reinvigorate the Saudi-led coalition's efforts to neutralize the Houthi threat in Yemen by providing comprehensive military support, including advanced weaponry, intelligence assistance, logistical support, and training to Saudi forces. This should also include working with the northern tribes. Fifth, the U.S. must provide unwavering support to Israel, both to safeguard its security, but also to demonstrate our reliability as a partner and ally. Finally, the U.S. needs to support the protest movement within Iran. We could be issuing official statements recognizing the legitimacy of the protesters' grievances and offer tangible support, such as facilitating secure communications channels
Madam
for
Secretary,
activists.
to keep within time, and we need to continue to Director Pollack, but I want to thank you because I agree with everything you said, so I'm not disagreeing with you. So, your multi-points are very good. I look forward to working with Congressman Connolly to try to see what we can agree. But we now need to proceed to Director Pollack. And again, we need to stick to the 5 minutes so that we can get to the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Representative Connolly, distinguished members, it's a great honor to be able to talk to you on this important subject. In the 5 minutes you've given me, I'd like to make 5 simple points to the subcommittee. First, I want to start by saying that I've been impressed with the administration's response to the Houthi attacks so far. It has been larger, more powerful, and more sustained than I had expected. It probably has rocked the Houthis and the Iranians and is undoubtedly a major element in the diminution in Houthi attacks we've seen in recent days. However, I am skeptical that it will achieve our ultimate objectives. Second point. It is certainly the case that the attacks on Red Sea shipping are serving Iranian goals in a variety of different ways. But we need to recognize that they are serving Houthi goals brilliantly, independent of whatever Iran is getting from them. This military campaign by the Houthis distracts from problems in governance and economic affairs in the Yemeni areas under oppressive Houthi control. It allows them to ingratiate themselves with the wider Arab and Muslim worlds, where they were strongly disliked, even hated, before October 7th. It allows them to play on the world stage as well, where their ultimate ambitions lie. Third, what we are attempting with the Houthis is ultimately a strategy of coercion. And coercion requires threatening something that the other side values more than whatever it is you want them to do or to stop doing. I am hopeful, but I am skeptical that merely destroying their anti-shipping capability will constitute such a threat to them. I think that that requires us to consider instead that which the Houthis clearly would value more than what they are getting from their anti-shipping attacks, and that is their control of Yemeni territory. That is their first priority. Moreover, the only times that we have seen the Houthis willing to negotiate and to make compromises, let alone concessions, have been when their control of territory has been threatened, as it was in 2018 at Hodeidah and in 2022 at Marib. That, in turn, suggests that the only way to convince the Houthis to cease and desist from these attacks will be to threaten them on the ground. Now, I want to be very, very clear about this. I am not suggesting American boots on the ground in Yemen. That is unnecessary. That would be entirely counterproductive. However, I do believe that it will ultimately require the United States to arm, equip, and train the anti-Houthi coalition that is operating under the umbrella of the government of Yemen. It could mean employing American air power as well, as we did in support of Iraqi forces against ISIS in 2014 to 2018. Finally, When this latest civil war broke out in Yemen, and we should recognize, Yemen has been in various states of civil war for decades, if not centuries. But when this latest round broke out, we staunchly believed that we had no interest in this conflict other than to shut down the fighting as soon as possible to limit civilian casualties. That was understandable, but it turns out it was also mistaken. The Houthis have proven themselves to be belligerent, aggressive, and convinced that violence is the best way to get what they want. They also share Iran's goals of driving the United States out of the region, destroying Israel, and overturning the governments of American allies. They are forces of repression inside Yemen and forces of aggression beyond it. Yemen, the United States, the Middle East, and the entire world would be better off without them in power in Sana'a. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Director Pollock. We now recognize Dr. Alterman for opening statement.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Connolly, it's an honor to appear before the committee once again. The Houthis are a paradox, a ragtag military operating on a shoestring budget that doesn't even represent a state, should not be a difficult adversary for the most powerful military in the world. Similarly, it should be easy for the United States to build a broad military coalition to protect freedom of navigation through seas that carry about 20% of global container trade and is a key conduit of both energy and manufactured goods to Europe. And yet here we are with Houthi forces continually threatening global shipping and the United States working principally with UK partners to strike at Houthi targets while regional allies and NATO partners keep their distance. Some call for robust U.S. military strikes in Iran to punish the Iranian government for all of its destabilizing regional actions. Some call for crushing the Houthis completely. I understand the attraction of decisively asserting U.S. military power, yet doing so without clear forethought would actually advance Iranian goals rather than U.S. ones and wouldn't do much to stabilize Yemen. As I outlined in my written remarks, the United States faces at least 5 threats in Yemen. The first is that the United States actually boosts the Houthis when they demonstrate resilience after a comprehensive U.S. effort to destroy their capabilities. This plays into a narrative that their mere survival represents a victory. We don't want the Houthis to present themselves as among the fiercest and most resilient fighters in the Middle East. The second is that the United States glides down a slippery slope of increased military engagement in Yemen, divorced from the scale of U.S. interests there. I worry that this moment would be part of a long cycle of U.S. engagement in and disengagement from Yemen, which has often been linked to counterterrorism and which has helped nurture greater violence in Yemen. The third danger is that the United States precipitates an even greater humanitarian disaster in Yemen, or is perceived to do so. I can see circumstances in which the United States is accused of instigating the spread of famine and disease in Yemen, with Iran, Russia, China, and some regional media amplifying that message. The fourth is that we fall into an Iranian trap, sucked into a grinding, open-ended conflict in the region that continues to put U.S. troops at risk without increasing regional security. This will ultimately undermine both the region's and the American public's willingness to sustain a military presence. The fifth is that the battle in Yemen deepens the rift between the United States and partner militaries. It's both remarkable and worrying that key NATO allies and key regional allies want nothing to do with any military operations in Yemen. No one can consider it sustainable when the U.S. is one of only a handful of countries willing to fight to defend public goods, and when close partners seek to benefit from U.S. actions without contributing to them. That is, of course, the world that many of our adversaries in the Middle East and around the world would like to see, and I could imagine U.S. military action in Yemen hastening its realization. The Iranians and the Houthis don't fight fair. They feel their relative weakness and the virtue of their cause justifies breaking the rules of war. They're skilled at using asymmetrical tactics, and they've positioned themselves to portray their mere survival as victory. We don't fight that way. but we're overwhelmingly the stronger power, and we have things that each side believes it needs. There is a role for our military strength, but we shouldn't forget that it's just a tool. Our ambition isn't military victory, it's using military instruments to provoke our adversaries to make a political decision to change. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank each of you for your testimony. And to show extraordinary bipartisanship, Congressman Connolly and I agree on something, that we're all limited to 5 minutes, even Congresswoman Manning. So, so 5 minutes, Congressman Baird, and I know he always follows through. With that in mind, again, I want to thank all of you for being here. Please begin the 5 minutes. And so I've had a long time interest, sadly, visiting 4 years ago an exhibit of downed drones that had been taken down by Saudi Arabia, by the United Arab Emirates. These drones, some had we're not talking about ones you see at the grocery store at $39.95. These have a wingspan of 30 feet, and they were to deliver munitions for indiscriminate killing of civilians. Indeed, it was also quite clear in English, they, virtually every one of them had made in Iran. So there was no questioning where they came from. And so to me, we've got to address this for the benefit of freedom of navigation in our country. Additionally, I'm very grateful too that we need to stand together for freedom to have peace through strength, and we need to address and know that freedom is not free. And I particularly sympathize, sadly, with the 3 Georgia Army reservists who were just recently killed. I've had sons serve in Iraq, Egypt, and Afghanistan. All 4 of my sons have served in the global war on terrorism, which is not over. The terrorists have many plans for us, which is really clear, of death to America, death to Israel. With all of that in mind, and I do want to congratulate Secretary Ledeen, you do have clear forethought. So see, y'all should get together and with the different points that you have, and we need to be clear. And in particular, the providing of funding by oil sales is just totally out of what should be done to actually promote peace through strength in the world. With that in mind, Secretary Ledeen, why did the Biden administration choose not to apply the stronger of 2 designations given on the foreign terrorist organization designation, which criminalizes providing material support and resources, which is so desperately needed to control the Iran puppets?
Chairman Wilson, thanks for the opportunity to respond. I think first and foremost, it's clear that the Biden administration from the beginning of this conflict has done the bare minimum. I think they realize that there's a political outcry because global shipping has been put at risk. So to continue to do nothing was not acceptable. So instead, the decision clearly has been made to do in terms of putting new sanctions, the bare minimum. So redesignating the Houthis as a specially designated group under a Treasury Department designation rather than the stronger foreign terrorist organization designation. So in order to say we've done something, but I would compare that, sir, to the responses that we're seeing militarily, in defensive in nature only. So in order to be able to say they're doing something, but the reality is our partners and allies, and unfortunately the IRGC and their Houthi proxies see very clearly that we're not taking real action. And so the attacks are continuing, and they will continue until a more forceful response is initiated.
And Director Pollack, indeed, the lack of response to me is very troubling because we've had attacks by the puppets of Iran that affect 40 different countries. This is not just America, not just the United Kingdom, and the effect of delivering grain to countries, causing potential starvation around the world. This is a defensive action on our part, what more can we do to degrade the Iranian capabilities in the Red Sea?
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I think that we need to recognize that Iran is trying to wage war against the United States and its allies all across the region. The Red Sea is one theater, and the Houthis are one actor in that. And I think that what we need to recognize is that we need to push back on the Iranians everywhere. The best way that we can push back on the Iranians everywhere is by helping our allies everywhere. And unfortunately, for the last at least 15 years, and let's recognize it has been under the last 2 administrations, including this one, that our allies have felt time and again that the United States has not been there to support them, that they've been forced to take on the Iranians on their own. And as a result, we've seen our allies make compromises with the Iranians. Most recently, and I think most flagrantly, the agreement between the Saudis and the Iranians brokered by the Chinese. Again, too much has been made of that, but nonetheless, it is a clear sign that these are all countries, allies of ours, that simply do not believe that the United States is supporting them, and that therefore they have to make compromises which they did not want to make.
Director, thank you. Thank each of you. And now I proceed to Congressman Jerry Connolly.
I'm going to defer to Mr. Sherman.
Thank you. If there ever was a foreign terrorist organization, it is the Houthi. We have not designated them. We have not designated them because that could possibly interfere with feeding the people they rule. This would come as a shock to General Douglas MacArthur if, in the day after Pearl Harbor, he had been informed that his number one objective was to feed the civilians of Japan. Those who cheer the Houthi, who shout their praises, claim to be progressives. They should take responsibility for the death that the Houthi have caused, not just in Yemen, but elsewhere. You see, 20% of Ukraine's grain exports go through the Red Sea, similar amounts from other countries. When that grain price goes up, people in East Africa, in Ethiopia, and Tigray, and poor parts of South Asia don't eat as much. They can't afford it, and they die. Not wasting disease that you can capture on a video, but rather they're eating 2 meals instead of 3, and that increases their susceptibility to death. I would like, without objection, to put in the record an article from The Advocate, perhaps the leading LGBTQ plus publication in America, which is headlined, Houthi Court Sentences 13 Men to Public Execution for Gay Sex. Now that's just one court in one province at one time. How many members of the LGBTQ plus are brutally killed by the Houthi year in and year out? So there is blood on the hands of the Houthi. There is blood on the hands of those who prevent us from taking effective action against them and shout their praises. And I see that blood is actually on the hands of people visible to me right now. Okay. I would ask for some additional time. I think, Dr. Pollack, you had it exactly right. We cannot limit ourselves to just trying to prevent the Houthi, reduce the amount by which the Houthi intercept shipping. We have to provide weapons to the legitimate government of Yemen and its allies. Dr. Pollack, Iran benefits from freedom of navigation around the world. Is it morally right that not a single Iranian ship has been stopped by the U.S. Navy, even for a day, when Iran interferes with the commerce of the entire world?
The morality of it, I simply am not qualified to comment on. Strategically, what I will say is that the United States has chosen not to do so repeatedly for a wide variety of reasons. But I think that it is important. I think that the question that you're asking, Congressman, is a very important one, and it should be on the table. As my dear friend Dr. Alterman has pointed out, the Iranians don't fight by the rules. They don't play by the rules. And we have handcuffed ourselves time and again in trying to respond effectively by doing so when they choose not to. We are confronted all across the region by a very determined, wily, and unscrupulous adversary. We owe it to put all the options on the table and consider them.
So if a ship taking luxury goods to Iran was delayed for a day or two, would Tehran get the message?
They might very well. We have seen that in the past, the Iranians are incredibly cautious and respectful of American military power. When they believe that there is no threat that we will employ it, they do whatever they can. When they believe that there is a chance we will employ it, they suddenly become much more cautious and respectful.
I'd finally point out that to have a durable ceasefire in Gaza, we need to see Hamas leave Gaza, just as we saw in 1982 when terrorists left Lebanon. And a durable ceasefire cannot exist if Hamas is there, because they've already declared they want to repeat October 7th again and again until the blood of Israelis flows again and again. That is the goal of Hamas, and that is the goal of those who support Hamas. I would ask,
I'd like to remind the audience that disruption of committee proceedings is against the law. Holding up signs or making verbal ignorant outbursts during the proceedings is disruptive. The ignorant outbursts particularly. Any disruptions will result in a suspension of proceedings until the Capitol Police can restore order. And indeed, there should be understanding. There are people here who want peace through strength. With that, I now recognize the Congressman from Georgia, Congressman Dr. Veteran Rich McCormick.
I believe there's more people to remove, Mr. Chair, but I'll start for now. I appreciate the witnesses' willingness to be here and to point out some very important things to us, both strategically and morally, that I think will affect the future of the United States and global peace, which is ultimately what every warrior wants. Anybody who's ever put their life on the line to go overseas for their nation does not want war. I don't want my sons to go serve overseas and die. I want them to live. I want them to live in peace. With that, I think it's very important to recognize what we've done and what the consequences are. In February of 2021, the Biden administration removed the Houthis, which were on the Foreign Terrorist Organization designation and their specially designated global terrorist group designation when the Trump administration had put it in place. At the time, Secretary Blinken cited humanitarian concerns as the reasons for these decisions, saying that the humanitarian aid could not reach the Yemeni people if these designations remain in place. I want to make a few points. I went on the first freshman Codell to Bangladesh, the largest refugee camp in the world. 1 million people that have been displaced through violence, who are living off of now $8 per person per month. There's people all over, we have a record number of refugees all over the world right now, starving, displaced, being raped, being killed constantly. And yet we're more worried about idealism than realism when it comes to who we aid and who we abet. And this is the problem. When we talk about worrying about designations so that we can help a people that the money's not even getting to, that the help's not even getting to, when you have an evil regime that's keeping the food from getting to the people who need it most. And instead, we've created an environment where the Iranians
Stop the genocide. Ceasefire now. Ceasefire. That will help people. 30,000 dead. 30,000 dead. Blood is on your hands.
when we're talking about realism and who we're trying to assist and who we're trying to claim as our friends.
Should not be assisting a genocide. Ceasefire now. Free Palestine. American taxpayers don't want this to happen.
I think it goes without saying that I'll reclaim my time. Okay, very good. Thank you. Ms. Leedon, do you believe that the Biden administration's reasoning for removing the Houthis from the FTO designation was accurate and the correct step in addressing the humanitarian crisis in Yemen?
No, I do not.
Do you think that the aid that has been forthcoming goes to the right people?
No, I do not.
Exactly my point. I think we need to be more concerned in supporting the resistance in Iran, for example. Those people who would stand up against the injustices, against women and children, against education, against rights.
Out of your mouth, you absolute disgrace. You should all be ashamed of yourselves. Ceasefire now. No more money to Israel. This isn't complicated. You absolute disgrace for human beings.
And there we go with the absolute misunderstanding of realism versus idealism. Iran is an evil regime. It's a theocracy that oppresses its people. It has kept women from their natural God-given rights. And yet we're more concerned with not getting food to the people that when we give aid to these corrupt agencies than we are with a resistance to a regime that's actually supporting all of our enemies all around the world and actually trying to kill Americans to the hundreds and thousands of efforts with armed aggression towards our troops overseas. We've lost Navy SEALs, we've lost Army National Guard, we've lost American lives, and we've put them in jeopardy every single day for the last, not just several months, but several years because of our policy. Dr. Pollack, how would you explain the Biden administration's seemingly timid defensive response to the Houthi aggression? Is it fair to speculate that it's due in part to the administration's desire to revive the Iran nuclear deal?
Congressman, first, I would encourage you to have the administration come and defend its own policies. But since you've asked me to speculate, I can certainly do so. I do suspect that that is part of what is going on. I think that they are hoping that at some point they can get back to it. And I think that, just broadly speaking, their approach has been to assume that negotiations are most likely when you start by making concessions to the other side. I understand the logic behind that, but historically, I don't think that it is ever proven to be accurate. People come to the table when they have a reason to do so. If you remove that reason for coming to the table, they either don't come or they show up not believing that they have to actually make concessions.
Well put, sir. It's been my experience in my over 20 years of Marine Corps and Navy experience around the world, whether it be in Africa or the Middle East or the Far East or anywhere else we're in combatant zones, that evil people only understand one thing, and that's strength. And that's what creates peace, not weakness, not concessions. And I think whether it be President Carter, President Obama, or President Biden, what I've seen is every time we give concessions, bad things are the result. And therefore, I would encourage my allies on both sides of the aisle, and I think we've made really good points from both sides of the aisle, to recognize evil and to deal with it accordingly. And with that, I yield.
Thank you very much, Dr. McCormick. And we now proceed to Congressman Jerry Connolly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Altman, welcome back. Good to see you again. Ms. Ledeen and others have characterized the Biden administration response to the Houthi threat as timid. Do you share that view?
I would describe it as cautious rather than timid, but I would argue the Trump administration was rather timid about the Houthis as well. After all,
The one Ms. Ledeen worked for?
I'm not a
Trump
historian,
administration?
sir.
Yeah.
Actually, I am
I
a
just
historian.
think
I'm sorry,
the
I
pot,
am a
the
historian.
pot
I'm sorry.
calling the kettle black just needs to be
Exactly.
called out, that's all. Go ahead.
The gentleman from Virginia and I worked together when he was a young man. I was a very young man. So we go back a little while. The Trump administration did not designate the Houthis as a foreign terrorist organization until the last 2 days of the Trump administration. There are excruciatingly difficult problems involved with characterizing the Houthis as a foreign terrorist organization, in particular well-meaning people attempting to save lives.
I know, I got to
can be-
interrupt you.
Right?
I only have 5 minutes.
Okay.
So, you got it. So part of this timid characterization apparently seems to be we're not willing to to go in more forcefully militarily to address the Houthi threat in the Red Sea and elsewhere. Remind us, was there not a pretty forceful military intervention by the Saudis in Yemen against the Houthis for some period of time?
There has been an almost 9-year effort by the Saudis. The Saudis are now trying to negotiate their way out of
Dr.
war with the
Altman,
Houthis.
please, answer the question. I didn't ask that part. I'm getting there.
Sorry, sir.
So how did that work out for the Saudis? 9 years of kinetic involvement that apparently others want the United States to emulate.
In fact, it was only 2 years into the Saudi engagement in Yemen that the Iranians got deeply involved with providing precisely the weapons that the chairman referred to. That didn't start at the beginning.
But
That
Dr.
started
Pollack,
2 years into
Dr.
the Saudi
Pollack made
war.
the point, a good one, I thought, that the Houthis, what they care about is territory. Did the Houthis expand or contract territory during this 9-year interval of Saudi aggression?
My recollection is it was mostly a stalemate. There was an initial period where they lost some territory, and I think it's been
So if one of the goals of the Saudis was to restrict the Houthis and to regain territory, it apparently didn't work. Is that correct? Right, didn't work. So it isn't timidity for the Saudis now to look at other options, one of which is engagement. Is that fair?
Yes.
And would it be fair to say, and the United States is encouraging that because of the lack of results of the alternative that was indeed tried over a 9-year period?
As well as the concern that there could be an open-ended regional conflict with no obvious endpoint.
Again, you're going far.
Sorry, sir.
Your brilliance precedes you, but you're answering a question not yet asked. But okay, that was my next one. What are the risks of the United States, with the best of intentions, deciding to expand its military response to the Houthi attacks? What are the risks of that? What could go wrong?
Well, one risk is that the Houthis keep doing it and we look ineffectual. One risk is that we end up in an open-ended conflict defending soft targets all over the world that is hard to defend. The problem is we have to be successful 100% of the time, and if we're successful 99% of the time, our adversaries point to the 1% and our people point to the 1%, and we look like we are failing instead of succeeding.
Is there a reason to believe that the engagement that the administration and the Saudis are involved in with the Houthis has promise of any kind of success?
I think as promise of some success, I agree very much with Ken that you have to come into negotiations strong. But I also think that you have to be willing to let bad people get something, not because you like them, but because they're a reality.
And that's something for the Houthis is ultimately a participation in governance of Yemen.
I think participation, not control, participation in governance.
Right. I thank you, and I thank you, Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Congressman Connolly, for abiding by the 5-minute rule. We now proceed to Congressman Jim Baird of Indiana.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank our witnesses for being here today. On Monday, the terrorist organization, the Houthis, we've been talking a lot about here. I'll call them terrorists because that's what they really are. But they launched an attack on an Iran-bound grain cargo ship. And as you know, Iran is a major Houthi ally, and this attack makes it clear that they are just widely targeting ships without a direct motive. And they claim that their strikes have been a response to the situation in Gaza. However, they've been targeting the ships that have absolutely no links to Israel. So are the Houthis using the war on Israel as an excuse to organize these inconsistent attacks? And can you explain the actual impact that these attacks have had on agricultural goods through the Babylon debt. So Secretary Ledeen, would you want to start that discussion?
Yes, thank you. I think it's important to look at the Houthi decision-making in the framework of being effectively and actually a proxy of Iran. So they are part of this regional escalation that Iran has underway right now. And they're one, the analogy has been made frequently that the Iranian regime's like an octopus, the head of the octopus, and there are many different tentacles, the Houthis being one. So as we consider the decision-making of the Houthis, I think it's important to note Iran plays a very large role in that decision-making, especially as they provide a lot of the weapons that the Houthis are using. So I would characterize it that way. In terms of the disruption of shipping, specifically of agricultural products, that is clearly one of their primary intents. They want to disrupt global shipping. They want to increase the prices. They want to hurt us. And in a way, we could think about it as effectively an Iranian sanction against us. Because they're raising the price of goods. And the longer this goes on, the higher these prices will become.
Thank you. Dr. Pollack, do you have any thoughts on that?
Absolutely. I think that you're absolutely correct, Mr. Congressman, in that initially the Houthis did begin these attacks in hope of showing solidarity with the Palestinians, because as I mentioned, they were deeply unpopular in both the Arab and Muslim world beforehand, and this was a perfect opportunity for them to ingratiate themselves with both communities. But I think you're exactly right that the Houthis are getting a tremendous amount from these attacks. This is exactly what they wanted. And what we've seen, as the administration has pointed out, they are attacking ships that have no connection to Israel whatsoever. It is very useful for them. It is terrific for them to demonstrate their importance, their power in the world by shutting down or threatening to shut down one of the world's most important shipping routes.
Dr. Alderman, you...
And Congressman, the other important thing is the Houthis are really bad at governance. They're really bad at governance. They're very unpopular. But being at war means that they bring people together. There's solidarity that comes from being on a war footing. Yemen has been at war. A lot of people who like using weapons in Yemen, and the weapons are on display. There is a way in which being at war is much better for the Houthis because it means that people aren't criticizing them for being so bad at running Yemen.
Thank you. I'm about to run out of time, so I think I've got more questions, but I appreciate your answers, and I'm going to yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman Jim Baird. We now proceed to Congressman Brad Schneider of Illinois.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank you for calling this meeting. I want to thank the witnesses for being here. It's good to see you guys, as always. Maybe I'll start with Dr. Pollack. When did the U.S. designate Hezbollah and Hamas as terrorist organizations? Do you remember?
I cannot answer that. I am sorry, Congressman.
I can't. I looked it up, so but it was October 8th, 1997. Was the U.S. right to designate Hezbollah and Hamas as terrorist organizations?
Absolutely.
Anyone want to disagree with that? Was the U.S. right to designate the Houthis as a terrorist organization? Dr. Pollack.
Yes, I would say they would. They certainly meet the definition.
Yeah. I think where we find ourselves, I'm going to just tell my wife I can't take her call right now, where we find ourselves, we face an immediate crisis with global implications. The Houthis are threatening global trade. They are citing excuses, but I think, as you guys noted, they are achieving their own goals, covering up their inability to govern. And we need to address that crisis with great urgency. But there's also a longer-term crisis that has more local implications, regional implications, which is the crisis facing Yemen and the governance of Yemen, creating one of the largest, if not the largest, humanitarian crisis in the world. And the victims of this are the people of Yemen. And the Houthis have their own agenda, but it is certainly not to lift up the people of Yemen. I mentioned Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis. Is there a common thread to those three organizations, Dr. Pollack?
Well, let's see. They all start with H in English.
That's not what I had in mind, and you know that.
They are all backed by Iran.
Right.
They are all anti-American groups. They are all anti-Israel groups. They all employ violence against civilians to achieve their ends.
Yep. And I'm going to quote from your prepared comments, but Iran is our enemy not because we want them to be, but because the government of Iran wants us to be. Can the same be true of the Houthis?
Absolutely. I think, as you know well, their slogan is God is great, death to America, death to Israel, curse the Jews, victory to Islam.
Right. And in fact, as they cheer that and chant that cheer, they're saluting. And their salute is not the typical salute we think of, but it's the Nazi salute. The Houthis are anti-American, anti-Israel, and anti-Semitic. And they are a threat, as I mentioned, to the region, but also a threat to the people of Yemen. Dr. Altman, one of the things we have to do is not just interdict Iran from supporting the Houthis, but find a way to end that support. Any suggestions on what we can do in Congress to try to address that and change that support?
I think partly it's important to recall that the Houthis aren't really strategic for the Iranians. The Houthis are a little bit of a freebie. The Houthis only cost the Iranians maybe about $100 million a year, which is about twice what it costs to run a think tank in Washington. But very impactful, as you've said. And I think we have to persuade the Iranians that the Houthis aren't worth it, and I worry that instead we're persuading the Iranians the Houthis are totally worth it because we're getting wrapped around the axle and talking about a whole regional program. And I'm saying this, they are a regional threat, as you say, but I think we have to right-size the nature of the Houthi threat. I think degrading their military capabilities is the right thing, but getting into a war of wills over the Houthis, I worry, is going to leave them victorious and looking strong and us looking weak.
And I'm running out of time, and I forget which of you said it, but you used the term coercion. And Dr. Pollack, coercion is convincing, whether it's the Houthis or the Iranians, that the cost of the actions they're taking are far greater, are far less. No, the benefits of the actions they're taking are far less than the costs. And we have to work to ratchet up the consequences and the costs for both the Houthis and the Iranians to change their course, because we can't allow the Houthis to disrupt global trade. And that is an interest not just for the United States, but for all of our allies. And we can't allow what's happening today to end hope for the people of Yemen who are suffering and deserve the right to govern themselves. I'm over my time. With that, I yield back.
Thank you very much, Congressman Brad Schneider. We now proceed to Congressman Michael Lawler of New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When President Biden took office, he made a lot of ill-thought-out and, frankly, foolish foreign policy decisions. But at the top of the list was delisting the Houthis. While the Houthis were a designated foreign terrorist organization under the Trump administration for clear reasons, President Biden almost immediately took them off the list. He did this apparently in an attempt to encourage the Houthis to reduce hostilities, enter into talks, and improve the conditions for the Yemeni people. But shockingly, just the opposite happened. The Houthis did not reduce hostilities and instead renewed efforts to expand territorial control inside of Yemen. We have also been unable to negotiate a meaningful resolution with the Houthis. And of course, the Yemeni people are still living under oppression. Dr. Pollack, can you go into some detail about the conditions and abuses the Yemeni people living under Houthi control have been living in for the past few years?
Briefly, Dr. Alterman began this. The Houthis are terrible at governance. They do not understand how to run a country. They never were particularly interested in doing so. And I think they were surprised when they had the opportunity to do so. The economy in Yemen is stalled badly. As we all know, there are enormous problems in terms of food distribution. Oil production, well, the Houthis have very little control over it, but in their areas there's very little going on. And we also need to recognize that the international community has been very rightly concerned about the humanitarian situation in Yemen for many years. The Houthis have not. Very famously, in 2018, a joint Yemen government and Emirati force was threatening to take the last Houthi-controlled seaport of Hodeidah. The world was terrified that there would be slaughter in Hodeidah. We descended upon the Emiratis, and the Yemeni government begged them to stop. They agreed to do so. The Houthis were forced to sign an agreement because they were about to lose Hodeidah. And the idea was they would leave Hodeidah to enable humanitarian supplies. They, of course, immediately reneged.
So that we're clear here, delisting the Houthis did nothing to help the Yemeni people and worsened regional security. In light of this administration's failed policy and the Houthis' continued aggression against the U.S., Ms. Ladine, do you think the group should be relisted as an FTO?
As soon as possible, yes.
Ms. Ladine, do the Houthis meet all the qualifications to be listed as an FTO?
Absolutely, they do, yes.
And we passed a bill through this committee last week to require the relisting of the Houthis as an FTO. So from that bill and from this conversation and from my absolutely clear picture of what is happening in the Gulf region, it is my hope that the administration does the right thing and relists them immediately as an FTO. One of the bills that I passed through the House Foreign Affairs Committee was the SHIP Act, which I led with my friend and colleague Jared Moskowitz. This bill would establish new sanctions on entities that process illicit Iranian petroleum. Ports and refineries that facilitate Iran's oil trade are effectively financing the Iranian regime and its terrorist proxies. It is no secret that Iran sends financial and material assistance to Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis, just to name a few. Can you all confirm that Iran provides funding to terrorist groups in the region?
Yes, they do.
Yes, absolutely.
Yes.
Do you all believe that the President and his administration, State Department, and Defense Department know, just like all of you, that Iran funds these terrorist groups?
There's no doubt, yes.
Yes, absolutely.
Yes.
How have Iran's proxy activities changed since the Biden administration came into office and relaxed enforcement of sanctions? Has it gotten better?
Far from it. They've become much more violent and aggressive, and they've caused many deaths and destruction across the region. Yes.
Mr. Lawyer, I think after the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, the head of the Quds Force of the Islamic Republican Guard, many of these proxy groups have had more autonomy, and I think the Iranians have enjoyed the fact that they have had less responsibility and less control, and that in many ways they have reaped more benefits from the misbehavior of these groups, but they have less control over these groups than they had under Qasem Soleimani.
So is your argument that Soleimani should have been left alone?
My argument is that assassinating Qasem Soleimani has not ended the threat from the Iranian proxy groups, and in many ways the way it has morphed.
Did you oppose his assassination?
Nobody. Do I oppose it now? I'm saying it didn't have the desired effect because...
Well, it doesn't have the desired effect because this administration has weakened its sanctions. When you allow oil revenues to increase $80 billion, nearly 60% since this administration took office, and these funds are being used to fund Hamas, to fund Hezbollah, to fund the Houthis, then yeah, you're right. There's not a good consequence of that. But that has nothing to do with assassinating Soleimani. That has everything to do with this administration's policy position to be weak on Iran. That's a policy choice that this administration has made. And that is a function of relaxing sanctions on the sale of Iranian petroleum. That's why I introduced the SHIP Act. China is the biggest purchaser of Iranian petroleum.
Mr. Chairman, you asked us to abide by 5 minutes.
And thank you very much, Congressperson Lawler. So we need to proceed, okay?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And hey, I was trying to be respectful to the congressman from Tennessee to get him back over here to sit quietly so he could ask his questions. And now I refer to the congressperson from Tennessee, Tim Burchett, the former mayor of Knoxville.
Knox County, but it's a little bigger than Knoxville City, but still, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Baird. Mr. Layden, is it Ladine or Layden? Ms.
Ladine, yes.
Ladine, I'm sorry. Nobody gets my name right either, ma'am, so we're good. What have the recent strikes in Yemen achieved?
There has been no demonstrable change since the strikes in Yemen.
In your opinion, what needs to be targeted so that these strikes would be more effective and that we don't keep hitting the same dadgum targets?
Well, I think we can, as a benchmark, use the insurance prices and shipping companies' decisions to reroute through around the Horn of Africa as a sort of guide for this. But the recommendations that I've made in my oral and written testimony are really focused on empowering our partners and allies. But yes, we should also be taking strikes against Houthi targets and IRGC targets that are training and equipping the Houthis as well. And that is, we know where those are. And we should be taking more aggressive action, not simply defensive actions.
It seems to me also that we keep hitting the same targets. I mean, we're not doing anything effective. Yeah, we're showing them how our capabilities, but to me, that just doesn't. It's just a waste of resources. Dr. Pollack, did I get that name right? All right, good deal, brother.
Yes, and talk about a name that gets mispronounced frequently. Well done,
Yes,
sir.
Yes, sir. Should we be concerned about any attempts to legitimize the Houthis as a government?
I think that we should. We need to recognize that this is not the government that the people of Yemen would choose if they ever had the opportunity to do so.
Right.
I agree with Dr. Alterman that they represent, or they may represent, a portion of the Yemeni population, but they don't come close to representing the majority of the people of Yemen.
Do you feel like the Saudis would be willing to accept the Houthis' de facto government in order to end their involvement in Yemen?
I think that what we've seen from the Saudis, especially since 2019, is I think that they probably would, simply because they don't feel like they have any better alternative. But I think that they very much would regard it as their least bad option.
Okay, and I'd like to ask this question, but maybe the rest of y'all could answer it as well. Can you speak to the human rights abuses committed by the Houthi rebels?
I can start. I can talk about their pervasive use of child soldiers. That is an absolute disgrace. And
Did you say child tortures?
child soldiers.
Soldiers, okay,
Yes.
I'm sorry.
That's a heavily documented phenomenon that, if you're not familiar, I sincerely recommend looking into it. It's been a problem for quite a while, and in the wake of these recent attacks, there's actually been a surge, people sending their children to join the Houthis, and it's truly a humanitarian catastrophe when you consider the coming generation in Yemen and what they may be like, what we might be dealing with, in the next generation. They're already building that. So I think that's one point. Obviously, there's a complete breakdown in medical care. There's pervasive starvation. My colleagues here can talk about that, I think, in further detail.
Dr. Alterman.
There are issues of women's rights, LGBTQ rights, as the gentleman from California talked about, basic rule of law. This is a government of thugs. It resembles in many ways a a place run by organized crime, and the misery of the people of Yemen is pervasive and continues every day.
All right, women are just basically possessions and gay folks are thrown off of buildings, that type of scenario. Is that what you're telling me?
This is both a repressive government and a government that believes it's asserting traditional values, which is anathema to our understanding of individual freedoms and human rights.
Dr. Pollack?
I'll just add to that, Congressman, that it's worth recognizing that the Zaydis are a very important old community of Yemen. Before 1962, it was a Zaydi imamate that ruled Yemen. But the Houthis are a fundamentalist element within the Zaydi community. And they are, again, oppressive, totalitarian in their behavior, fundamentalist in their outlook. And I don't think that we have a very good handle on even how many Zaydis support the Houthi rule. I think that there is, I'll put this way, considerable anecdotal information that suggests that there are plenty of Zaydis who look at the Houthis and say, these are not the people who we would want telling us how to live our lives.
Okay, thank you. I've gone over. Yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your indulgence.
Here, here. Thank you very much, Congressman Burchett, all the way from Knox County, Tennessee. With this in mind, I'd like to thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony and the members for their questions. The members of the subcommittee may have additional questions for the witnesses, and we'll ask you to respond to these in writing. Pursuant to committee rules, all members may have 5 days to submit statements, questions, and extraneous materials for the record, subject to length limitations. And I'd also like to thank the committee staff for their dedication. And again, this is bipartisan. Congressman Connolly and I frequently work on issues together, remarkably enough. And so we can work together with a very capable staff of the Foreign Affairs Committee and of the subcommittee. Without objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned.